Hello, and welcome to Nimbus Studio. I'm your host, Tyler. Today we're going to be starting a new 11 by 14 encaustic piece, the theme of which is technically a landscape, but really more importantly is about artistic collaboration and the sharing of studio space, both in a physical sense, but also in a virtual space too. In the physical, I do share my studio with my wife. And she just completed a mixed media piece that I wasn't sure was going to honestly gel as a whole, but she did a fantastic job doing so. And she created this piece here that is a mix of photo collage, paper craft, canvas, paint, and she was just able to really create something quite unique. And in watching her create this and watching her go through the process of it, it kind of laid some foundations for a new project for me to dive into. And that is something that I think is at the core of art, and that is sort of the collaboration and sharing of new and different ideas and seeing how those ideas can influence other artists when they are privy to those pieces of others. And I really hope for Nameless Studio to eventually become that for a virtual artist community where we can all gather and see what each other's working on and sort of jive off of that energy and those thoughts and ideas. So, with that in mind, let's get started on this new piece. Okay, so we're going to start out a little differently today. The undercoating of this is actually just a quick little sketch I did of my wife and I's dog, Pizza. The brook scene that I am portraying in this piece and that my wife portrayed in her piece is a brook that we visited quite often in our last abode. With our dog Pizza quite often. If you look closely at her piece, you will actually see both myself and our dog in her piece. I'm not going to put any actual beings in this piece, but we are going to hide our dog Pizza kind of underneath this landscape. So Pizza will be with us, but not really noticeable. But that's the nice thing about sharing these videos is now I am not the only one that knows this undercoat is here. It's now known by any and all who decide to watch this video. And thank you again for doing so. So we're right now just taking some Neocolor 2 pastel to kind of wash out a little bit of a background for this piece. Again, it's going to be, when we're all said and done, a very sort of lush and overgrown brook, riverside little brook scenario. So, and we're gonna work with a lot of green tones going on this, working with a lot of foliage and those sort of colorations. Not quite monotone, but very near monotone for this piece. So again, the Neocolors are water soluble, so we just add a little bit of water to it to just disperse all of that pigment and color to get a nice wash effect. Because really when we're all said and done, there's not much of this is going to be seen overall except in, say, the water element itself. The rest of it's we're going to build up quite a bit with layers of encaustic and more Neocolor and so on and so forth. So when we're all said and done, both Pizza and this wash layer are going to be fairly covered by the end of it all. Sad to see the dog go, but he will be there in our hearts and in our mind when it's all said and done. So now I'm just going to do a little bit of wash layer to let it sort of bleed down the substrate, get a little bit more sort of that kind of wash movement going on in this underlayer. Just taking our time to really get some interesting sort of marks and movements before we move on to the actual encaustic layer. Oh, and there goes little Pizza snout. So this being the furthest back layer, and most of it again being covered, we don't want to overwork it, but at the same time, I know that this is our furthest back detail. It's also going to be the thing that's furthest from us. So there's a bit of a, we want, where things that are going to be the furthest back, we want to have the most haze, the most sort of dilution to it. And the closer things are, the more in focus it will become. So having a nice sort of washed out sort of horizon line is going to be something that we really want to have going for us. So we don't want a whole lot of fine detail going on in this layer because it's meant to be the furthest back, so the most out of focus. So we don't want hard lines or anything like that. We want things to be very soft in being very far back and very out of focus. So now we're just going to pat dry some of these areas to get a little texture and some more movement going on, just to tone things back just a little bit, pull some of that pigment on so it's not quite as saturated and dark, but still giving us some really interesting marks and movement going on. So I'll just kind of take a paper towel and just sort of dab around, mix around. Once the Neocolor's dried, even just a little bit, it's kind of fun to just sort of move around the pigment itself, because some of it does still stick to the actual substrate, but now you're just kind of moving bits of it around. It's a very malleable material, especially once it starts to set just a little bit. And now we're going to add just a little bit of encaustic, mostly a white mixed with a little bit of a gold tone here, just in a couple key, like very far back areas. When you apply the encaustic, the pigmented encaustic directly to a substrate like that, you don't get a whole lot of movement from it. So we need to be pretty precise as far as what we're putting and where we're putting it, because it's not going to be able to move much with the torch or anything else. So we either want to cover it pretty well or kind of know exactly what bits we're going to be showing. So right now this is really just titanium white with just a little bit of a gold in there just to warm it up just a little bit. And we're putting these in areas that I really am thinking are going to highlight sort of the furthest away but sort of whitest of white parts of this piece. So that's what we're seeing here, is just a little bit of that foundation of the composition, trying to really hone into where the whites are going to be. Kind of like where the watercolor, your whitest whites are actually the furthest back layer, and you're building color on top of that. And that's kind of what we're doing here. We're having to paint in our whitest whites, but these are still kind of our base layer. So that's what we're doing here. And now I am going to fire these just to soften them up. Again, we want to be very out of focus. So the paint itself is not going to move much because there's no wax under it to really move it. So it doesn't go anywhere really when I'm firing it this way. It's just slightly softening those edges and maybe even burning them just a little bit to give another little bit of a warm tonation going on there too. So this is more just to diffuse what we put down more than anything else, because you can't really move the paint if there's not either a ton of it or a base layer of wax for it to move on top of. So you don't get much movement at all here. You're more likely just going to burn your substrate if you try to move it too much. So with that though, now we are going to put down our base layer of the encaustic medium, which again is just encaustic medium. It's a beeswax and damar resin mixture. I get it in this pellet form here, just because it melts a little quicker and is really easier to tell how much you're using when you grab like a handful of pellets. You know a bit better what you're going to be putting in rather than trying to melt a big old block of straight wax. So we're just going to put this base layer down on here. We're going to do a pretty thin coat because we're going to be building a lot of layers, but at the same time keeping a bit of this, especially that bottom wash, kind of exposed. So we want to build layers, but we don't want to feel like we're overbuilding while leaving something looking kind of unfinished as well. So we want to start with a fairly thin layer so that we have a lot of breathing room for how we build. And always just going back and forth. With the base coat, you can be fairly loose with it, especially since you're going to be going back and using a torch to kind of fill in and fill out any of those areas that you didn't hit maybe quite as heavy as another. But just doing nice, quick, smooth brush strokes in a singular direction is really the best way to go about it. You see we have a lot of texture being built at this point, and that's, again, with a nice smooth brush, there's a lot of texture going here. So if I didn't fuse this layer and just started putting more paint on here, we would get a lot of texture happening, which could have been an interesting way to go with this piece, but I opted to go with a very smooth substrate to start, knowing that in building itself, we're going to get a little texture going on there. I didn't want to start with too much texture. So we're going to do a nice thorough fusing of this layer to get it nice and smooth. Because of just the nature of how we're going to be building these next few layers, we're going to be getting a bit of texture anyway. But yes, as you saw, there was a lot of texture that we could have been building on top of if I did not fuse this layer. And you see the base layer below the substrate, below this wax layer didn't really move or melt at all. Even that thin layer of encaustic was enough to sort of protect it from the heat element that we're working on here. So yeah, there's very little risk of moving a layer once you put a clear coat layer on top of it. It really does do a good job of just sitting on top and protecting everything else. And as you can see, we have a much smoother surface now. Now, no texture whatsoever to that layer of encaustic medium. It's nice and smooth. And pretty even. There's only just one or two little spots where it looks like wax has gathered a little bit more than a couple other spots, but very minor, especially for a piece of this size. And that's where we're going to stop for today. We still have a long way to go with this piece. At this point, we really just have our base layer down, and we really still have quite a few layers and scenarios to go before this one really starts to take shape. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you want to see where this one's going and more like it, please subscribe to Nameless Studio, and you can always see more of my own work at tylerrogersart.com. Until next time, be seeing you.